Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about crises. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, if you are the engineering tech lead and if there's a vulnerability in your live application which needs your critical application to be made unusable until it is fixed, how would you handle the situation? Well, usually the way I deal with it is that I do my prep work and my homework first, because the thing that usually is good to know in a crisis, because you're talking about a vulnerability here, which might just indicate that you have a security issue. So the thing that you want to do before you start panicking is to figure out what is the nature of the vulnerability that you're dealing with, and if that vulnerability is as critical as you actually think. Now, in your scenario here, we basically, it's very rare that it is this critical, guys. If it is, you usually have mitigation strategies for this, where an example would be if you have a leak somewhere where you're leaking, potentially leaking personal information, then you have to get ready to fix that immediately. And if you've done your homework, you should be able to change the code in pretty quickly. You should also have, there are other circumstances where you might have more troublesome problems. Then there's a coding error somewhere where, if I recall right, what was the name, Heartbleed or something like that, where it's like at the protocol level basically, or say the log4j exploits and things like that. These are issues which are more globally, spans more areas, which makes them much trickier to deal with. But even in those sorts of situations, you can fix the problem without bringing down the whole system. It's not going to be easy. In some cases, you might have to replicate your entire infrastructure in another solution because you're on like a version of a server or something like that that has a known exploit or something like that. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that you are correct, that there is such a problem, such an critical issue that you have to actually bring down the system. I also want you to know that in some cases that is not an option ever. If you work in the medical industry, for example, or something like that, then this can't actually happen. There is no exploit that is severe enough that you bring down the system. And if there is, then you are basically going to have to figure it out, as I was saying, in some other fashion. Which, yeah, let's just pretend that it has happened, but I've never seen this happen where it's that critical. But if it does happen, I hope that you have done what I usually do. You need to have, and this is where the leadership and personal relationship becomes very important. So something that a lot of software teams don't really do, which is a bit of an amateur move in my opinion, but it's actually very common, is that they don't establish connections with their immediate stakeholders. They don't create any communication lines or anything like that. So if you take, say, inspiration from the major websites of the world that you all depend on, what they usually do is that they have a communication page where they tell you if there's an outage. They send out emails or something like that. They have ways of getting in touch with you if something critical is happening. And the reason why they established that early on is because the reality is that if you lack foresight as a software development team, this is especially common, not just in a crisis, but it's very common for when you introduce breaking changes or anything like that. The software team, as most humans they usually will work in the short term. And the problem with working in the short term is that you have the problem now, or you want to ship the feature now. The problem is that you have other people who depend on you that haven't been told that this thing is happening. And the quicker you can get to them and inform them of the situation, the more time they will have to respond to whatever you have to do, which is the foundation skill, communication, of any leadership. Because if you don't tell people, the earlier you can tell them, the more they can plan and adjust and so forth. And so there are all these things that become much easier if you have this established. And as I said with releasing, for example, if you have a release that's going to introduce a breaking change or some feature update, you ideally want to tell people about it as early as possible. And so you need to establish these communication pipelines where you gather all your stakeholders in some central, like if you have a mailing list or you have a specific Slack channel or something like that, where they know that they can get a hold of you, and this is where you will send out critical information. You can even have web pages, which, as I said, for the bigger companies, they usually have something like that. And then you send out information related to this and basically explain the situation as best as you can with all the diplomatical skills that you can possibly muster, and then you just pull the plug on the thing because you can't do anything else, because in your situation you're claiming that you have to take down the system. As I've said, I've never really seen something as severe as that happening, like where you like literally no security issue I can imagine is critical enough that you need to kill the whole system, unless, as I said, it's like, I don't know, the bank has a flaw somewhere where you can just pull out cash at random or something like that. But if it gets to that point, then it's a little bit like in that old movie GoldenEye, like when the hacker Boris runs into the server room, he just starts pulling cards out. That's basically what you're going to have to do. But in order to handle that situation, which is a complete catastrophe, the best thing that you can do is to just communicate as early on as possible. And then afterwards you need to do damage control, where basically you have to explain why this happened, what steps you're going to take to make sure that it never happens in the future, and if it's for an this is one of those situations where, if, as I was saying, if it's like a critical system where the requirement has been that this never happens, some heads are going to have to roll or something similar to that, most maybe. But then if you've designed a system that is so critical that it can never go down under any circumstances, and it does, if you haven't done your architecture well, then you're just going to have to shock this down as this sucks and move on to the next thing. So what I want you to take away from this is that the way that I usually handle a crisis situation where I might have to do something that is like a breaking change or something like that is that I very early on establish communication pipelines with everybody who is a direct stakeholder, because basically I know that just as when I deal with feature development or when I have to do something that requires work on their part, I need to be able to tell them about it before I want to do the change. And this is a long-term thinking strategy that you have to adopt you should ideally adopt it fairly early on, because if you want to make a change and you know you're going to make that change at any given point, you have to account for the adjustment for everybody else, which is the basics of leadership. If you want to build a feature, you have to prepare some work so that you can present your idea to your team, so that the team can adjust and start planning and doing what they need. It's all kind of downstream, right? And that downstream mindset is the difference between having a very good relationship with everybody who is downstream from you and people hating your fucking guts. Because short-term thinkers, they just do the change and then like everybody else has to deal with the fallout from that. But people who care about their stakeholders, they usually have a little bit of a foresight before they make these changes. So if you establish these communication pipelines early on, you make sure that people know who you are, they know how to get a hold of you, and you could build a little bit of a relationship with the people. Usually they will, honestly, I've always found this to be true. People are always upset when things go bad, guys, but people are more willing to forgive and be, understanding of people that they sort of know a little bit and genuinely feel are, on average, this is, Frederick is usually a pretty good, nice guy, and he fucked up now, and that sucks, but, okay, let's cut him some slack. And I think that you should do the same thing, guys. I've always found that, pointing fingers and things like that and so forth, it really is, it is a strategy you can pull. I never really felt the need for it, because I've always found that if you just on an average day all the time do a really good job and you treat people the way that I'm basically telling you, like with care, with understanding, and the like sort of empathy for the impact that you have on them, and they feel that you understand them, they will usually be fine, even if something really, really serious happens like this. That's at least what I've seen. Have a great day.